It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Filip Smolík from Institute of Psychology and the talk for today will be structural priming and the mental representation of syntactic structure. So I will give word to him.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation and for hosting my talk. I would like to start by introducing the general idea of what I'm going to do. I'm not entirely sure what kind of presentations and topics you are used to hearing, but this idea, the idea of this presentation is to give you some basic information on a method or a phenomenon that has developed into a research paradigm for the studying of mental representations of syntax or linguistic structure. What I will try to do is to introduce the experiments that have been done using this method, and my emphasis will be on showing the range of possible questions and experimental manipulations that can be used. You will see that probably the syntactic structure you are going to hear about is very rough compared to the sort of syntactic representations you are used to working with. It's just the case that the psycholinguistic experimental approach has not gotten at the detailed level of syntactic structure representation, or a level as detailed as many linguistic theories are. So first, I want to introduce the word priming. This is something that appears in a number of textbooks on psychology and psycholinguistics, and it actually describes a broad range of phenomena that can be generally characterized as the effect of processing one stimulus on the subsequent processing of a related stimulus. And this can be studied in memory, in lexical processing, and as we will see, in syntactic processing as well. Probably the canonical kind of or type of priming manipulation is what we call syntactic priming. When people have to process a word, it's easier to process this word if a related word has been presented immediately before, or not even just immediately, but sometime before. So this is an example of a priming manipulation. You can have an experiment where people see a word and then see a different word, and they have to react in some way to this second word. And if the first word is something that's semantically related, like desk and table, the reaction here will be faster and more reliable, with less errors, and so on. So this type of priming has generated a lot of research into the structure of lexical and semantic representations. But I'm just using it to give you an idea of what it is when we talk about priming. All priming experiments include something that we call primes. Those are the stimuli that influence the processing of the target stimuli. And now about structures or syntax. So already in the 1960s, some researchers noticed that repeating sentences with the same structure in some way facilitates the processing of these sentences or makes it easier to process this. The experiments mentioned here looked at people reading blocks of sentences that either shared the same structure or had superficially similar structures but were actually different. So they are recurring mistakes and they are forecasting cyclones. Those are sentences that are actually quite different in their syntactic structure, but superficially they sound quite similar. They use similar function words and morphemes and so on. But if there was a block of these copula-type sentences and a block of sentences where these copula and progressive sentences were mixed together, the blocks, the mixed blocks were read slowlier and with more errors. But at that time, it was a relatively isolated finding. If you look at the citations of this article, I think I tried it for this one, you'll see that there has been just one mention in 30 years, and only in late 90s, researchers who studied structural priming, that I'm going to mention in a minute, started rediscovering this line of work. Another preliminary for introducing the idea of structural or syntactic priming is a number of studies that noticed that people have a tendency to repeat themselves or their conversational partners in production. So they tend to say things that are structurally similar. Here's one example from a study that looked at the discussions between burglars and their accomplices. So it's an interesting source of research data. And you see just a piece of conversational exchange where blocks of structurally similar utterances or parts of utterances are repeated. Another study, maybe one of the first experimental studies on structural priming in production, was the study by Willem Lefeld and Kelter, who used a very simple method. They just phoned different stores and asked a question. And the question, it was performed in Dutch, but the approximate equivalent in English would be, they asked either at what time do you close or what time do you close. And when they asked at what time do you close, people tended to respond at 6 o'clock, while when they asked what time do you close, the responses were like 6 o'clock. So the structure used in the question affected the structure used in the answer. These were some preliminary observations that led to the introduction of an experimental paradigm that is described as syntactic or structural priming. And as I mentioned when talking about priming, in this experimental approach, we have one stimulus that serves as the prime, one stimulus that influences or may influence the processing of another stimulus that would be the target stimulus. The way the original experiments, this describes the experiment by Catherine Book, even though the picture is taken from a slightly later study, but it shows nicely how these studies were run. So these studies looked at whether it is possible to influence the syntactic structure people choose when they describe pictures. This is a picture of a simple transitive event that can be described as the alarm clock awakened the boy, or the boy was awakened by the alarm clock. Obviously, you could describe it in different ways as well, but these two ways were the responses of interest in the experiment. Before people described this picture, they have been presented with prime sentences, with sentences that were either in passive or in active voice. So they heard, well, they didn't hear, they read actually a sentence such as the boat carried 5 people, or 5 people were carried by the boat. The finding in this study was that if people repeated a passive structure, the likelihood that they would use passive to describe a picture like this increased. It's not so surprising, but this was the first systematic experimental way of showing it. Just to give you the background, the people who responded in these experiments were told that this would be about memory, that this would test their ability to remember the pictures and the sentences, and then they would later be tested on how well they remembered. So the instruction sort of disemphasized the structure. It was about, people were thinking about how to store as much as possible. And there were a number of filler sentences and filler pictures that actually did not fit into these active-passive conditions. So that's just to show that in these experiments, generally, you include a number of ways to cover your research interest, and most of the time, the people should be naive about the actual purpose and about the fact that you are interested in whether they are using active or passive, for example. The experiment actually didn't look just at active and passives, but also at the distinction between prepositional and double object datives. So in English, you can say things like a rock star sold some cocaine to an undercover agent, or the same thing can be described in a slightly different way. A rock star sold an undercover agent some cocaine. So it can be a prepositional dative, in which case the recipient comes last, or it can be a double object dative where the recipient comes immediately after the verb phrase in the sentence, or after the verb. This is just a summary of the results to give you an idea of what kind of data these experiments provide. So rows in this table correspond to different priming conditions. The columns correspond to the different forms of the target sentences, of the picture description. The numbers here are the percentages of active they are the percentages of this structure used after this prime. So you see that when the prime included a prepositional dative, the secretary gave a cake to her boss. About 50% of the picture descriptions included the prepositional dative, and only about 30% included the double object dative, like the secretary gave her boss a cake. These numbers do not add up to 100%, because anytime you do an elicitation study, you want people to describe something, you have a number of cases when they do something you cannot score. They just respond in a way that's uncodable. You see quite clearly, especially for the prepositional versus double object dative manipulation, that whatever the prime condition is, the percentage of picture descriptions repeating this prime structure is about 50%, but and the other structure takes between 25 and 30% of the picture descriptions. The effect was statistically significant in actives versus passives as well, but the size of the effect was substantially smaller, probably because, just like in Czech, passive is not a really preferred structure in English. So this was one of the first experiments that showed that some aspect of syntactic structure tends to be preserved from generating one sentence to the generation of the subsequent sentences. Obviously, there is a number of things that could be preserved in the example, in the experiment as I described it. So it could be prosodic structure. It could be repetition of function words. So the pairs of prime and target sentences were constructed so that there would be no lexical overlap in the open class words and nouns and verbs and so on. But necessarily there was some overlap in the function words. And if you say a passive, you have to use the auxiliary verb. If you use a prepositional dative, there's going to be the preposition there. It is also possible that what happens is that you just replicate the order of semantic roles. And actually, Book and later other researchers performed a number of experiments that tried to confirm or disconfirm various possible influences of this sort. So, for example, one study, I think this was already in the original study by Book in 1986, looked at the role of function words, namely at the possibility that it's actually the preposition to that's primed in the double object versus prepositional dative manipulation. And they used as primes either sentences with a to dative or with a benefactive that's introduced by a different preposition, but structurally it is very similar. And they found that these two sentences as prime sentences were equally effective in priming the double object dative picture descriptions. Another experiment looked at the possibility of prosodic effects. So, Susan Boke, a book to Stella, is a prepositional dative sentence. Susan Boke, a book to study, is sounds very similar. It's metrically the same, but structurally something quite different. And the experiments showed that this was an effective prime while this wasn't. So that excluded the metric explanation. Some experiments, or the initial experiments, suggested that structural priming does not rely on repeating semantic categories. So, for example, these two sentences were equally effective primes for picture descriptions that included verbs of transfer of possession. So, the widow drove her Mercedes to the church is about changing location. There's not really any recipient there, but it was still equally effective prime to something that was structurally similar to this sentence. Also, it was shown that progressives actually can prime passive structures. So the plane was landing by the tower, even though by the tower is nothing like a logical subject, and this is not the object of this verb, or the patient of this verb. Nevertheless, this, in the study by Book and Lobel, proved to be an efficient prime of a passive structure. So these were this was the sort of initial series of experiments that introduced syntactic priming. By the way, I'm using the words syntactic and structural priming interchangeably. Some people also introduced the term syntactic persistence or structural persistence. These are, in my talk, the same things. Perhaps it's best to talk about structural priming because the term syntactic priming has been used previously for something slightly different. So it's probably better to talk about structural priming. Also, as we'll see in a few minutes, we still don't know exactly to what extent this phenomenon is about syntax. The examples I talked about mentioned the active versus passive sentences or direct or prepositional datives, but a number of different structures have been examined and manipulated in structural priming experiments. So, structure of coordination or coordinated constituents versus sentences, the structure of noun phrases, adjective modified or relative clause modified, finite versus infinitival complements of verbs, progressive versus simple past. This is from a children's experiment by Larry Leonard. Also, the relative clause attachments in ambiguous sentences. I mentioned the experiments that suggested that structural priming is not primarily a syntactic, a semantic phenomenon, that even sentences with semantically quite different constituents can affect target sentences that have the same sort of rough syntactic structure. But at the same time, subsequent experiments suggested that when the rough syntactic structure, the order of noun phrases or prepositional phrases is preserved, there are some semantic tendencies to preserve the order of semantic roles. Other type of semantic influences in priming is the fact that when the prime and target are semantically related, priming tends to be stronger. So if the target sentence is something like the sheep that is white, it's going to be influenced to a stronger extent by a sentence such as the goat that is black than a sentence, the box that is red. So even though structurally these two prime sentences are very similar or identical, they are in different semantic distance from the target sentence. And this semantic effect is actually very close to something we know as the lexical boost. So lexical boost refers to the fact that if the prime and target sentence share the verb, the priming effect tends to be stronger. So for example, if the target sentence is the grandpa gave a toy to his grandson, or the grandpa gave his grandson a toy, it will be more strongly primed by a prime sentence that also includes the verb give, as opposed to a sentence that has a different verb. However, it's important to realize that even here, even with the different verb, the priming effects are preserved, are there. So lexical boost is an increase in strength, but not the priming as such. This manipulation has also been studied in different languages. So it's not limited to English, but it's been shown in Dutch, in German, in I think I know about a study from Japanese, and you would probably find a wider range of languages. What is quite interesting is that there is a number of studies available that demonstrated cross-language priming. So in bilingual speakers, presenting a prime sentence from one language can affect the way people form sentences in a different language. So these studies actually showed that there is a certain degree of communality between the structural representations of different languages in people's heads. What I mentioned until now was mostly the sort of experimental design pioneered by Catherine Boak. So something that we call the production to production priming. The experimental participants produce a sentence. They read a sentence, so they actually are forced to produce it, and then produce a picture description. So they produce another sentence. Very soon it has been found that the prime can be equally efficient if it's understood only, if it's only comprehended. So you don't really need to repeat the prime sentence or you don't really need the subjects to press the subjects to repeat the sentence or the participants, because if they hear it and you are sure that they processed it, it's usually an equally efficient prime of their picture descriptions. Most of the studies, or the studies of the sort book did, used the percentage of a certain type of structures as the dependent variable. So you saw that about 50% of picture descriptions were in prepositional dative if the prime sentence was prepositional dative. This is quite easy to understand, but it actually requires relatively large numbers of participants and does not tell you much about the online processing of the sentences, about what happens at the moment of generating the sentence. Different experimental approaches have been tried. So, for example, Potter and Lombardi tried recall after rapid serial visual presentation. That's a mode of presentation when you see individual words for a relatively short time, like 100 milliseconds. So you can barely read the sequence of words, but usually you can, if it's not a too long sentence, you can read 5 or 6 words. But if you don't repeat it immediately, the representation you form is sort of fragile. And if they presented the prime and target sentences in this methodology, the recall of the prime sentence, of the target sentences was actually influenced by the priming manipulation. A number of findings have been achieved using written sentence completion method. That's a relatively convenient method when people are given sentence fragments and their task is to complete the fragments just in any meaningful and grammatical way. And you can actually influence or construct your experimental conditions by changing the length and the amount of syntactic information that's contained in the fragment. So if you provide a fragment such as the secretary gave her boss, the only meaningful and grammatical way to complete this would be a double object dative, gave her boss a cake, for example. But if you just include a fragment the secretary gave, it's open how the people finish it. So that's how these studies used it. Picture description in dialogue is similar to what Book did. However, it's all involved, included in a scripted situation where people are told that they have some common goal with a conversational partner, and the conversational partner is actually a confederate of the researchers. But what happens there is very similar to what Book did. But people focus on the dialogue. They focus on explaining to the other person what they need to say. And it's interesting that the priming effects are even stronger in this dialogue type situation. Sorry, I'm just skipping ahead to see how much I have. So these are methodologies of influencing production. I haven't mentioned that people also looked at the latency of production, so at how fast people start generating the target sentence. There have been some effects found, but not huge. But measuring latency in production of these big units, such as whole sentences, is a little bit problematic. Now you can ask whether people looked at syntactic priming in comprehension. So whether our comprehension of sentences can be affected by repeated syntactic structures. I have not included this into my presentation because it would be a topic for another presentation of this this length. And yes, people did, but it's proving to be more challenging than structural priming of production. So structural priming of comprehension probably does exist, but is limited to, and we don't know exactly to what it is limited. It's just harder to get it, and we don't know exactly why it is. I may get to a series of experiments I ran trying to address one possible hypothesis here. I wanted to mention that there is also neuroscientific evidence about the effects of structural priming. So a recent study by Ledoux and Trexler showed that the P600 component of the ERP response is smaller when people hear a similar type of structure before the target sentence. So this was this is a component by which people react at syntactically strange things. But it can happen even in grammatical sentences if these are garden path sentences, if these are temporally ambiguous sentences. And but if you repeat two temporally ambiguous sentences so that people had the opportunity to see the ambiguity in the prime, the confusion of the neural processing system is diminished in the target. So that's about this study. Nopeny and Price showed that even at the level of the activation of neural tissue, repeating of syntactic structures can have an effect. So when people heard blocks of repeated sentences with the same structure, the activation in left anterior temporal area, so at the temporal pole on the left side, was decreased. But this was not modeled exactly according to the book type studies. It was more similar to the old studies by Meller and colleagues, because functional magnetic resonance does not have enough time resolution, and you have to actually have stimuli that take a number of seconds. So they used blocks of sentences instead of individual sentences. So I want to mention two studies that used structural priming to argue for something that's closely related to linguistic theory, or the theory about how structure of language works. The first of these studies is by Catherine Book and her colleagues, and they tried to test whether they could find evidence for something like deep structure type of representations. So in some areas of generative grammar, there is the assumption that there is a difference between surface syntactic structures and some sort of core structures that contain the semantic core of the event, and from these core deep structures, different superficial or surface structure can be derived. What they did was eliciting description of pictures with inanimate agents. So the picture with the alarm clock and the boy in the previous slide was actually taken from this study. So people had to describe things like the boy was awakened by the alarm clock, or the boat carried 5 people. These were presented after 4 different types of primes. The primes differed in whether they were active or passive, and they differed in whether their subject was animate or inanimate. Now, the assumption of what they call the mediated mapping approach, that would be the approach that involves some sort of a deep structure representation, would be different than the prediction of a direct mapping approach that generates the surface structure directly. And the difference is what should happen after passive primes. So these are predicted proportions of active type sentences. So if you have an active prime with an inanimate subject, you expect the largest proportion of actives, because this will be a completely analogous to the target structure. So your target structure is an active description of an event with an inanimate agent. But in passive, the predictions are different because it's sort of hard to describe, but the general idea is that after a passive prime, obviously the number of actives decreases in both experiments because the prime was passive, not active. But if the mediated mapping approach is correct, the active sentence, such as the boat carried 5 people, would share something with an animate subject passive prime. It would share the animacy of the agent. Therefore, this approach would expect that the proportion of active descriptions of these pictures after passive primes will be larger after passive primes with animate surface subjects than with inanimate surface subjects. But in the direct mapping approach, there is nothing of this sort expected. In the direct mapping approach, the idea is that the response to the target sentences should be affected by the animacy of the surface subject. So if the surface subject is animate, this is going to decrease the likelihood of using the active in the picture description, because this active picture description would have to have an inanimate subject. The results of the experiment were clearly in line with the direct mapping predictions. I'm going to go into the details. I wanted to show the logic they are used in running the experiment. Another experiment that tried to make a fairly high-level theoretical point was by Martin Pickering and his colleagues, who focused on the distinction between what they call the one versus two-stage models of sentence formulation. One-stage model would be a model that formulates the sentence the way it is structured, so goes directly to the surface structure. A two-stage model would be a model that predicts that we first generate the structure of dependencies in the sentence and only later linearize them into a sequential representation of how the constituents come in sentences. In order to see which of these approaches is correct, they used the standard manipulation with direct object versus, or double object versus prepositional datives. But besides these two priming conditions, they also included a priming condition with so-called shifted prepositional datives. So in English, this is possible even though it's not preferred if the recipient is substantially shorter than the direct object. So saying something like the driver showed to the mechanic the torn overall is used for stylistic reasons when there is a heavy noun phrase in the direct object. What the experiment showed was that this sort of primes had no effect on the targets, on the picture descriptions that were elicited in the experiment. This suggests, at least according to Pickering's interpretation, that the one-stage model is more adequate than the two-stage model. Because in the two-stage model, the structure of this is actually the same as the structure of a standard prepositional dative. If you alternatively suggested that people actually, what's primed in people is actually the order of semantic roles instead of the structure, these types of structures should actually prime double object datives, because in these shifted prepositional datives, the recipient comes immediately after the verb. So this should prime sentences like the secretary gave her was the case, and that was not the case. The shifted primes work like control primes, like the same way like intransitive sentences. So these are two examples. These are two examples of studies that attempted to make a fairly abstract theoretical point based on the study of structural priming. I'm mentioning them because I think ultimately this is the sort of promise that this experimental paradigm has. But of course, there's a lot of technical and practical issues involved that lead researchers to do a much larger number of experiments. But the biggest question is, what is it that is primed in these experiments? And we don't have the definite answer now. At least these experiments show that our sentence processing mechanisms involve representations of the sort of verb phrase, noun phrase, prepositional phrase. This can be considered as well documented by the experiments. It may not seem like such a big deal, but I think it's an important first step in going deeper. Martin Pickering and Victor Ferreira suggested that these units or these mechanisms that are primed are actually similar to something that has been described as phrase structure rules early on in the development of generative grammar. And I think it's appropriate, but we are operating at a relatively rough level of syntactic structure. We are not going to the details of sentences. We are working with relatively big chunks. There is a slightly different approach to structural priming that's based on implicit learning. So Franklin Cheng and actually Catherine Bog, the founder of this research study or this research branch, suggested that the operation of structural priming is a sort of symptom or consequence of normal acquisitional mechanisms. So the fact that after hearing a certain syntactic structure, we tend to repeat this structure is a consequence of the fact that this is how we learn language. This is, I think, not necessarily inconsistent with this approach. But personally, I miss in their approach a clearer definition of what are the units on which the priming manipulations operate. Cheng actually does have a formal neural network model that behaves very much like humans in its susceptibility to the priming manipulations. But as with many neural network models, it's not entirely, well, at least to minds like mine, it's not entirely clear what the representational units or levels there are in the model. But it's an open field. I think before I quickly mention some of my experiments, I want to say that 10, 12 years ago, if you look at the literature, there was one article about structural priming per year. Today, I went to the MLab conference, and about a quarter of all contributions there deal with structural priming in some way or another. So it has become a sort of mainstream experimental paradigm that is, in my opinion, one of the few ways we can address syntactic level of representations in psycholinguistic research. So, what's the time? Well, I have spoken for an hour, so I think I don't want to overstretch it. Maybe it's going to be more useful if I open the discussion, and maybe we can get to some of these things while we discuss the topics. So, thanks for your attention, and if you have any questions or comments, please.
Thank you, but anyway, I would be really interested in the experiments you made with the children, because I would be wondering if there is any difference between the results of the kids and adults. I mean, in terms of generating the new structures or following the patterns from the priming.
Well, the situation is such that there's no direct way to compare this, because kids and adults differ in too many aspects at once. So you can't do the things you do with adults with kids. But it is a topic. Well, I'm going to show you some of my stuff. So this is what we show children, and we try to see if their comprehension of the sentences that describe pictures like this is somehow affected by repeating syntactic structures. We actually have pairs of pictures, like a frog licking a pig, and the other member of the pair is a pig licking a frog. So two more or less nonsense events involving the same participants, but in the opposite roles. You can describe these in Czech with subject initial sentences or even with object initial sentences. One of the experiments I did or do repeatedly is looking at whether repeating the same type of description, whether subject initial or object initial, leads to an improved performance in identifying the target picture. But my results are sort of, well, I get conflicting results. But back to your question, and more generally, structural priming in acquisition studies has been used mainly with regard to the question of how abstract children's representation of syntactic structure is. In the acquisition research, there are two broad camps. One would be something called the item-based approach that says that children initially start learning syntactic structures verb by verb, or actually word by word, but mostly this is around verbs because they determine most about the structure of the sentence. And people like Michael Tomasolo suggest that children initially learn how different verbs behave, and they don't have connections between verbs. They don't have representations like this is a transitive verb, and any transitive verb should have its subject, the agent, before and the patient after. And the other camp in this approach is people who suggest that this knowledge of these abstract rules, how all transitive verbs behave, for example, is relatively early. So people who argue for the early abstract structure assume or would expect that structural priming happens quite early. And there are conflicting lines of evidence. So people from the labs associated with Michael Tomasello or Elena Lieven actually found structural priming in older children, but not in younger children. People from different labs reported findings that showed structural priming in children as young as 3 years. But in general, it's hard to compare adults and children. We know that this happens in children, but we cannot use the same forms that we use in adults to test kids.
Yeah, many thanks for your very interesting talk. I think we might find very clear, I would say even immediate connections between what you said and between what our linguistic theory, I mean the linguistic theory which is developed in this department hypothesizes or just assumes to be true. So, starting from the end, there is a certain hypothesis here which speaks about what we call systemic ordering. And systemic ordering for us is a hypothetical order of what you may call thematic rows, so we have other terminology, but it's not important here. So that there is a certain systemic ordering of these rows, of these thematic rows, which is observed by speakers when there is no context which would indicate some different ordering. We did some experiments which with a kind of observation called psycholinguistic experiments, with a lot of speakers, where they were supposed, they got different contexts, and one of these contexts was a context without context, so to say, something that would happen. And they should not be aware of that, and they were supposed to order the thematic rows in a corresponding order. And it resulted in some clear orderings. I mean, when I say clear, it means that more than 80%, or we were advised that we can say that if more than 85% people agreed on that particular order, that this might be a kind of quasi-confirmation of the hypothesis. If there were less than, then we then looked into other things like lexical items which are used or something like that. So that's one point which I would like to add to what you have said about this possibility of ordering. The other thing is that I feel very uncertain, I must say, with sentences without context. I think that the objects, the human objects which you test, may have in their heads some context, and then they can respond according to those contexts. So that's only one kind of doubt which I have. I think you have answered my third question, but I wanted to be sure. You didn't measure the reaction, how long the reaction took them. How long was the pause between the reaction?
Are you asking about my experiments with children, or?
Well, in general, I would say from the very beginning of your talk.
There are studies. So if I go to the bibliography here, this was for a long time the only study that looked at latencies of production. Mm-hmm. There was also a study by, I think, Hartziker and Westenberg, who looked at latencies, but actually at latencies in written production, so it's sort of far stretch for immediate linguistic responding, but still they got something. But as I said, the production experiments are problematic because measuring what can you measure in sentence production? Sentence production takes 3, 4, 5 seconds when you want to produce a sentence. So you can measure the latency to the first word, but it's questionable whether this is very informative. Incidentally, last summer, like in summer 2009, and I spoke to a woman from Patrick O'Shea's lab, who said that they were trying to look at the latencies to different parts of the produced sentence. So they would slice the responses people made and marked the beginning of the sentence, the beginning of the verb phrase, the beginning of the recipient phrase in the double objects, or something like this. I don't know exactly. I don't believe they published anything of this, but it's a good idea. So people are working on it, but there's been a lot of doubt. The latency type variables or latencies were measured more in the study of comprehension. But as I mentioned, this is proving to be more challenging. But there are at least 2 studies now that found facilitating effects of structural priming, of repeating the structures on the comprehension of sentences, mostly temporally ambiguous sentences. So I was myself trying to find this in sentences that were not temporally ambiguous and actually failed, and I'm still in the process of trying to find out if really it's a null finding because there's nothing there, or if I just used weak methodology for this. There is a number of studies that looked at structural priming of comprehension using something else than latencies. For example, the predictive eye movements. So people tend to look at things they expect to hear about. And Sheepers and Crocker, for example, found out that this could be influenced by structural priming. So,
eye movement?
Well, I'm bound to, because we do eye tracking research. So I'm not sure about these predictive eye movements. Definitely, eye movements are a good way of measuring how fast people read. It's more precise than having them do what's called self-paced reading, so reading word by word and measuring how long each word was shown. It's more natural to have them read things. I'm just running an eye tracking experiment with kids, so we'll see if...
That was just a provocative question. And just 2 minor remarks. When you spoke about the, I don't know how you call that, the 1 layer and 2 layer approach.
Yes, this 1 and 2 stage.
Point. Well, but you know what I mean. I just wanted to remark to that this picture, that for us in our approach to deep level, we don't only speak about these thematic roles, but we also distinguish between the different orders of the thematic roles. So, for instance, if we have active-passive, we wouldn't just say it's actor and patient, but we also put into our representation on the underlying layer of the deep layer the order of the two. So it was just a remark which I had to that. And my last very, very minor thing, you had there the English sentences with the dative with preposition, and you just said that you may have this order prepositional phrase with to, and then the object at the end, when the object is heavy, is a heavy phrase. But yeah, that's it. I think that, well, I'm not an English native speaker, but I was always taught that you don't use, I was instructed not to use the to dative if preceding the object phrase, but rather to use the non-preposition phrase, like the driver showed the mechanic something. So I don't know how much this adds to the argument, but it's just...
Well, definitely this is a marginal structure, an atypical structure, and the authors acknowledged that, but they used the fact that even though it's marginal, it is still, it exists. People do use it occasionally, especially in written work. Incidentally, I have one loose association here, but recently people showed that even a non-linguistic stimuli can lead to sort of structural priming effects. So even if the prime sentence is not strictly speaking grammatical, you can make an argument that the manipulation tells you something about how the target sentence is processed. So that would probably be the logic the authors used.
Okay, but in any case, I was very much interested in your talk, I must say.
Thank you. Where do you get the corpora from?
Corpora?
I mean the sentences.
Sorry?
The sentences.
Sentences?
The dependency tree bank can be really helpful for you, I would say, because you can easily find the sentences with double objects and so.
Yeah, well, most of the things I talked about were things that were reported in the literature, and I suppose the sentences were made up by the experimenters because they needed a very specific type, and it's also always depends on what pictures you can get. Mentioning corpora, there is a line of work that looked at structural priming in corpora. That's quite interesting, but I haven't mentioned it here, so and I don't know that much about it. And for my own experiments, again, I do mostly experimental work, so I have to make up the stimuli according to what the situation requires. I oftentimes use the Czech national corpus to sort of check if something appears, to check for the frequencies of things, but especially for the child experiments, it's not that useful because the corpora just don't reflect the way we talk with children.
So my question would be if there has been any research on how backwards the priming works, so say 2 sentences, 3 sentences, and so on, how big the context has to be.
So you mean whether the prime sentence influences only the immediately following sentence or something later? That's very interesting, and it has been a key sort of argument in the discussion between the implicit learning and the temporary activation approach. Because if there is something like nodes that represent different combinations of syntactic units, and these nodes work in a similar way that semantic nodes in semantic priming, you would expect there to be a very short-timed effect of priming. If it's implicit learning, you would expect rather long-term effects. And in fact, authors arguing for this, the study is by Franklin Cheng and Catherine Book and Zenzi Griffin, showed that there was a fairly long-term effect of structural priming in certain or in the most standard experimental paradigms, in the book-type experimental paradigms. Some other people suggested that for example, the Lexical Boost I mentioned seems to be short time at the same time. So Rob Hartzucker showed that the general structural priming seems to be long-term, so it goes over more sentences. You can have a passive sentence, then 5 unrelated sentences, and still there will be an effect on the production of the sentence that comes 5 sentences later. But the lexical boost will disappear over this gap. There's been one study that sort of relativized this finding by Holly Brannigan and Martin Pickering, and I think that one found that for written production, the effects were not as long-term as for the spoken production. And I don't remember this one exactly. But definitely, this is a strong argument for the implicit learning approach that the authors use, that the effects are not immediate. The effects work in a sort of longer time window than just a single sentence.
It might be also an argument for us having a very long working memory, right?
Well, I'm not sure if it's about working memory as it is defined by the standard psychological or as psychologists understand it normally. But I agree that it could be an argument that these activations take longer than previously expected. I think, my own feeling is that there's nothing really exclusive. I don't understand why the authors advocating for this take this as an alternative theory. And maybe they don't. Maybe I just misread their statements or discussions. But in my opinion, it's really the implicit learning approach is about the mechanism that is responsible for priming, while this approach is about the units that are affected by priming. And those are not exactly the same things. They are related. So I agree that it might be the case that our temporary syntactic representations are activated for a longer time. There's a whole branch of research going into that direction.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? In that case,
thank you.